If the limited government era that led us through the enormous changes of the Industrial Revolution was so wonderful and such a good template for what we might follow with respect to the artificial intelligence revolution, then why did we leave the limited government system behind for FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression? You're about to find out. Hi. I'm Todd, and this is the On Wealth and Progress podcast. If you're interested in balanced, factually supported commentary for a better future, you've come to the right place. In the last episode, we observed that the best way to minimize the risk of job losses from artificial intelligence is through job creation, which means we should approach AI with an economic system capable of delivering high growth through periods of transformational change. We also discussed how today's debate over whether to follow a top-down, expert-driven system or a bottom-up, regulation-light model harkens back to Hamilton and Jefferson's debates at the founding of the country. As noted in the last episode, it was Jefferson's limited government model that produced unprecedented rates of growth, even as millions moved from rural America to the industrial cities, millions more immigrated from abroad, and everyone left their candles and horses and buggies behind for electric lights and automobiles, and eventually even airplanes. Furthermore, we also saw how, even as all of this transpired, we fought the nation's bloodiest and most righteous war to end the system of slavery the whole Southern economy had been based on, and then, barely half a century later, marshaled the resources needed to help save Europe from complete self-destruction in World War I. All of which begs the question: if the limited government system was so wonderful and potentially such a great template for artificial intelligence, then why did we leave it behind in the 1930s for FDR's brain trust-driven New Deal? In this episode, we'll begin by exploring this important question, and then we'll look at where the more expert-oriented, interventionist approach has led us. But first, let's take a very short break. As the Great Depression wore on, America came to mistakenly blame our worst downturn in nearly a century on private market failure, symbolized most prominently by the great stock market crash of 1929. While it took decades for the truth to emerge, however, we now know the economy turned down in the summer of 1929 before the market crash, and that the Depression was caused not by private market failure, but rather by unprecedented failures of government on a scale consistent with the magnitude of the downturn itself. Internationally, the Depression was caused by Europe's extraordinary deficit spending on World War I, which burdened France, Germany, and Britain, the three largest economies in Europe, with overinflated currencies, uncompetitive economies, and war-related obligations they could ill afford. After a decade of failed policy attempts to resolve these intractable issues, both the international monetary system, which had long been orchestrated by Great Britain, and the system of international finance started to crumble in the late 1920s before completely collapsing in the early 30s. Domestically, the primary cause of the Depression was the failure of the Federal Reserve, as even the Fed itself now admits. The Fed was started in 1913 to provide emergency funds needed to keep isolated bank runs from turning into full-blown panics. But when a series of bank runs broke out between 1930 and 1933, the Fed failed to provide the monetary medicine that would have kept the bank runs from metastasizing. Cumulatively, roughly 30% of the nation's banks were wiped out, which led to a sharp contraction in the money supply and a severe drop in confidence in the system. Industrial production turned up in the summer of 1932, and the bank failures finally reached their nadir in early 1933. But, like most other contemporary observers, FDR failed to understand either the real causes of the crisis or that he had inherited a recovering economy. After taking office in March of 1933, FDR and his so-called brain trust implemented massive regulations and interventions as a part of what they called the New Deal, which effectively brought the limited government era to an end. While a few of these interventions were helpful, in the aggregate, the New Deal severely prolonged the economic downturn. From the end of the Cold War until the Depression, there had been many downturns, but unimpeded by government interference, the economy had recovered quickly and robustly from every contraction, including a severe post-war downturn in the early 1920s, just prior to the Depression. In even the worst of these episodes, it took just 1.5 years to go from trough to full recovery. But because of the New Deal's many failed interventions, however, during the Depression, it took almost 7 years to go from the trough in the first quarter of 1933 when FDR took office to full recovery at the end of the decade. Nevertheless, as mentioned earlier, none of this was understood at the time, and it took decades for the truth to emerge, and as a result, most of us grew up learning that the great stock market crash on Black Friday in 1929 symbolized the private market failure that ushered in the New Deal, which, according to this narrative, saved us from the tendency of private markets to run amok. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and discuss where our failure to understand the real causes of the Great Depression has led us. In the 1960s, Lyndon Baines Johnson saw his Great Society programs as an extension and expansion of the government interventionism ushered in by his political hero, FDR. But the resulting run-up in spending under LBJ created chronic budget deficits that the Federal Reserve stepped in to finance through misguided monetary policy. This pushed America off the gold standard and led to anemic growth, high inflation, and sky-high interest rates that persisted until, in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan finally gave Fed Chair Paul Volcker the political backing needed to curtail the Fed's mistakes. Reagan's free market agenda, which included sound money, deregulation, and tax simplification, kick-started an economic resurgence that, under Bill Clinton's stewardship, ran through the 1990s and culminated in a series of balanced budgets. But then, unfortunately, under George Bush, we reversed course. Bush took us from surpluses to chronic deficits as he increased core government spending, which excludes defense and interest expense, as a share of GDP. And after the collapse of the tech stock bubble in 2000, the Fed returned to cheap money policies to try and juice the economy. Whatever short-term benefit abnormally low interest rates orchestrated by the Fed might have produced was more than squandered by the 2007 collapse of the housing bubble, which pushed us into the Great Financial Crisis and then the Great Recession. As I've shown in my book, the housing bubble and the financial crisis were caused by failed housing policies and the Fed. Barack Obama, still reading from the mistaken history that glorified the New Deal, essentially repeated the same mistakes of intervention made previously by FDR and LBJ. Like most contemporary observers, Obama mistakenly blamed the Great Financial Crisis on private market failure and ramped up government regulation as an antidote. Adding insult to injury, he also pushed up deficit spending to peacetime records to try and reinvigorate the economy after the Great Financial Crisis. But all of this failed to ignite growth and pushed up debt to dangerous levels. On top of this, still failing to acknowledge their own role in the housing bubble and the financial crisis, the Fed again resorted to misguided monetary policies during the 2010s, which also failed to stimulate growth, but helped subsidize the government's dangerous borrowings. Later, when COVID pushed Trump out of office, Biden outdid Obama's deficit spending, which led to the worst bout of inflation since LBJ's Great Society programs back in the 60s. In a 1-2 punch that helped bring Trump back to the Oval Office, the Biden administration followed its deficit spending jab with a regulatory knockout punch. So, what do we have to show for all of this? A dangerous run-up in federal debt held by the public, chronic deficit spending, and a vast regulatory apparatus, all of which has resulted in anemic growth for over 2 decades. Now, I can't help but think how far off path the Fed's failed policies and our mistaken understanding of the Great Depression has pushed us. In the next episode, we'll consider the Trump administration's artificial intelligence plan in light of what we've learned so far here. And we'll take a deeper look at the differences between the limited government era and where progressive policies have led us. Today, we face important challenges, like how to deal with the AI revolution. But none of these challenges are greater than those we have overcome time and again throughout our storied history. Here's hoping your day is as bright as America's future. I'm Todd, and thanks for your interest. If you found this helpful, please subscribe and recommend it to at least one other person. If you'd like to learn more and to find links to my free On Wealth and Progress newsletter and book, please visit my website, toddsheetswriter.com. Thanks again.